Prologue. Ross Barnett, George Hamilton, Arlene Francis. Well, I'm asked why Southern writers particularly have a penchant for writing about freaks. I say it's because we're still able to recognize one, said Flannery O'Connor. First time I read that remark, I laughed at O'Connor's knowing wit, her divine slyness. And yet, as in her stories, when such wit, such slyness can curdle together into a kind of wisdom that sits like clabber atop the churned up innocence of our lives, it also left a sour, long ago taste in my mouth. It tightened my throat. The first freak I ever recognized down south, where I was born half a century ago now, was my own reflection in a Mississippi mirror. I was confronted with a glass of such clabber served ice cold with day-old cornbread crumbled into it on the day of my mama's funeral, November 19th, 1964. When my brother and sister and I officially moved in with my maternal grandparents, who lived in the country a few miles outside a little town called Forest. Our father, a sports celebrity of local renown, had only recently been killed in an automobile accident. His death, he flew from his beloved baby blue Volkswagen Beetle after running a stop sign at the country intersection and colliding with a car with Neshoba County plates, made headlines across the state. 1 year later, my mama was now dead of esophageal cancer. Dying so soon after my father, my mama enabled me to utilize what little sorrow I was feeling for him. Her dying deepened it, allowed it to seep forever into my life like the blood that ran from his flat-topped head when it hit that newly paved country road. Red, thick yolks of the stuff oozed past his butch-waxed thatch of bristles and blackened even more the fresh asphalt, drawing the flies that buzzed over neighboring pasture where they swarmed around cattle that looked up for a second at the sound of the crash, then turned away to focus on their cuds. Different sorts of headlines followed the death of my mama, my siblings and I being the subject of human interest features located next to a bunch of ladies' club columns and weekly county newspapers. Nestled among the stories about high school football, pork futures, and firebombed churches. The Sessoms Orphans became our handle as we paraded around the state and were asked to do some fancy dribbling at the halftime of charity basketball games set up for our college funds in little country gymnasiums. Such places became secular sanctuaries to me. The sweet syncopation of balls bouncing against hardwood during a shoot-around was as competitive, as alluring as that Rich versus Roach record of battling drummers I listened to once I grew up and let my love of Ella Fitzgerald lead me to other LPs. Gymnasium. It was the first big word I ever knew, ever learned. It made masculinity musical to my little ears. I went around saying it softly to myself over and over, proud that I was able to pronounce it, loving how pretty it sounded in my mouth. Gymnasium. A man's name was in there. C was in there too, the very sound of I knew to say when I really liked something, when it tasted good and when I wanted to taste it again. The gymnasium was also the place where my stern father felt secure enough to show me some tenderness. He had been an All-American basketball player at the state Southern Baptist Institute of Higher Learning in Mississippi College. Drafted by the New York Knicks in 1956 after my mama had just given birth to me, he had returned home to Manhattan at her behest. A Southern belle through and through. She could not see herself managing to survive in the vertical hustle and bustle of a northern urban high-rise with a squalling newborn to take care of. She told my father he had a choice. Either he could play for the Knicks and live alone, or he could come home to her and his child and make a more horizontal life in Mississippi, where there was lawns, honey, and languor was an assiduously honed attribute. At least that's what his older sister, my Aunt Gladys, corpulent, overly rouged, and cautious of tongue, told me a couple of years after my parents' deaths. I don't know, about newly 9, was sitting on the floor next to her chair during a weekend birthday visit at her house in Van Winkle, Mississippi. My brother and sister, rowdy with innocence, were down the street being corrupted by the neighborhood ruffians who ran roughshod through the backyards and alleyways of Van Winkle, equipped with BB guns and bazooka bubble gum and a few half-smoked viceroys they had purloined from their unknowing, know-nothing parents. But all that was out there. I sat inside and busied myself reading Aunt Gladys's collection of movie magazines, which she kept, in a cut-down little laundry basket by her Barker lounger. Such a shame. Such a shame your daddy always wanted to play ball against number 14, Bob Cousy, she said, mentioning the great Boston Celtic player as she pushed back in her chair and perused Dorothy Manor's syndicated column in Modern Screen for any mention of George Hamilton or Susan Oliver. I perused it. George Hamilton. Susan Oliver. I'd just seen the two starring in Your Cheating Heart at a Saturday matinee back at the Town Theater in Forest and fallen madly, confusingly in love with both of them. Your mama and daddy could fight with the best of them, but they were devoted to each other ever since second grade in Hopperville, where we all grew up as best we could, Aunt Gladys said, kicking off her waitressing shoes. I stared at her corn pads. I pouted at the very mention of my dead parents and pretended I could not smell her feet. Never let nobody tell you different. Not even me, she said. Sometimes I wonder, though, what would have become of them if they lived a little longer. Love's a funny thing. She yawned, drifting toward sleep. So funny, I forgot to laugh.